Human trafficking is actually where one person or group of people will purchase or use others for purposes of profit through control and exploitation. There tends to have to be a sale that occurs. You have to be able to show force, fraud, and coercion. And in a case of sex trafficking and a minor, you don't need to show that, because it's presumed that the minor doesn't have the ability to make the choice. At the very core of it, it's the exploitation of vulnerability. And so what we're seeing is that most of the cases of human trafficking, there is, at the core of it, the victim has some vulnerability, and that's what is being exploited in order to control them. No, there's also labor trafficking, and in fact, worldwide, labor trafficking is more prevalent than any other, than sex trafficking. There was a rescue of 96 people in India from labor trafficking. They had actually been controlled and exploited and forced to essentially pay a man back for nets that he'd given them to fish, but the prices were so exorbitant, it's debt bondage, they were never ever going to be able to pay that debt back. They were controlled through verbal and physical abuse as well. Someone found out about it. They contacted an organization who did rescues, who works with international justice missions, and they were able to rescue 96 people yesterday. Here in the U.S., I think we hear more about commercial sex trafficking, probably because we have a crime called prostitution. And so you hear more about it because there are arrests and other things associated with prostitution. We do believe that there's quite a bit of labor trafficking. We have seen some of that here in Virginia. It's just harder to identify, so I really don't have good statistics on that. What I can just tell you is what the statistics tell us, and that is the top 20 human trafficking jurisdictions, Washington, D.C., and Richmond, Virginia, are in those top 20. If you map out the top 20 human trafficking jurisdictions, you'll see a line down the I-95 corridor on the East Coast, across the bottom of the United States, up the West Coast, and then St. Louis and Chicago in the middle of the country. What it appears is, though, that the traffickers are using our major corridors and arteries in order to perpetrate their crimes. We have had cases of trafficking victims rescued in this area, certainly not to the extent that you've seen in DC or Richmond. Over the last few years in the Northern Virginia area in particular, efforts to rescue trafficking victims have increased. There's been a higher level of awareness. And in fact, there were some cases of where trafficking victims were living at home, going to school during the day, so these are all minors, being picked up by their traffickers after school, taken someplace and sold for a couple hours or an hour or two, and then brought back home and dropped off without anybody knowing. That's happened in Fairfax County. And so it does happen here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We've also seen some labor trafficking situations where some folks in, I think it's a fast Quickie Mart type of place, in more southern part of the state were being, or at least southern from here, were being trafficked. So there are a number of cases where we've had trafficking victims, and it goes below the surface. One of the issues that we see, particularly with regard to if you're thinking about sex trafficking, that traffickers are counting on the way that we all look at prostitution here. We think it's a victimless crime. I'm not saying I do, but there are a lot of those in the public that certainly do, and so we tend to look past what might be a situation where there's trafficking. But what I can tell you is that generally any place where there is prostitution, where you can find prostitution, you'll be able to find trafficking. There's a number of different ways that it occurs. Most of the time, the traffickers are looking for those who have some sort of vulnerability. So there tends to be a process called, say, a lure. And the number one lure, not just in the United States, but in the world, is the boyfriend or lover boy lure, where, you know, a girl, like it could be a boy, statistically, it seems like there's more girls than boys, but we think there's more boys being trafficked than we had originally thought. So what will happen is that, I'll give you an example, a girl who's maybe has a rough family life, who is, you know, maybe in a household where there's alcoholism or some other type of abuses going on, and you know, they meet someone who tells them they're beautiful and special and buys them things, and they think they're quote unquote in love. And then, you know, there are different ways where it happens. Maybe there's a debt that's incurred that needs to be repaid. And hey, you know, there's a way to repay that debt, and it's prostitution. Sometimes drugs are used to control, manipulate, beat. It's a pretty violent situation. Traffickers will also look for runaways. Statistically, runaways within the first 48 hours, I think a third or more will, and those statistics actually may be higher now, but will actually run into a trafficker. They'll look for them at local shelters, homeless shelters. They know, I've spoken to law enforcement locally, and they said the traffickers know where these runaway teens go, and so that's where they will try to find them. But there are a number of locations. The internet's another place where they'll use different lures. They'll pose as a teenage boy, again, love interest. Hey, let's meet, and then she's taken someplace and beaten and raped, and she thinks it's her fault because she thinks she's stupid. And the truth is, she's not stupid. She's just young, right? Just young and inexperienced. Well, I mean, the traffickers, what we're seeing is, you know, certainly these are criminals. Some of them are raised in family situations where trafficking is accepted, and we're also seeing a lot of gangs. There's one of the national gangs, I believe it's the Bloods. Trafficking has really always been one of the things that they've used. They're an LA gang. They've gone national. um, they've other gangs and other criminal organizations have realized that it's very profitable and fairly low risk, because a lot of times, with a drug, you have to buy a drug, get the drug into the country or manufacture the drug and then sell it, and then you've got to go do the whole process again. Whereas they get a trafficking victim, particularly with regard to sex trafficking, they will be able to sell her over and over and over and over again. And so, and with the majority of society thinking of prostitution as being a victimless crime, people tend to look past it. Also, a lot of us don't tend to interact with folks who are, say, in that type of situation. That's why CBJI, we like to focus some of our educational training on vocations like healthcare workers, hotel motel workers, who will actually be in a position to see a trafficking victim, and then giving them the tools to know what to look for and then what to do if they think they've found something. The buyers are really all of us, and I say that I say that, one, to get your attention, but two, so you understand. In terms of commercial sex trafficking, the buyers are going to be anybody who is engaging in as a buyer of prostitution, and so the buyer may think that this is a person that they're engaging with sex who's making the decision of their own free will, and this is what they've decided to do, but they really don't know. I don't know how they would know. And so anyone who engages in that type of situation is certainly one of the buyers. In terms of kind of everyone else, if you go out on the internet, there's slaveryfootprint.com, and you go through and answer some questions, and it'll tell you, and it's certainly a little assumes you're not really paying attention to what you're buying. Will tell you the number of slaves that you have working for you. And what's happened over the last, say, 5 years or so, I think companies have really started understanding that there is slavery in the world, there are unfair labor practices all over the world, and so there are some companies who have really started to pay attention to their supply chains. And so if you, I think Ford Motor Company was a company that did this. They looked at all their investments and supplies chains, and they to identify if they had any situations where there might be unfair labor practices or slavery, and they did away with those types of relationships. There are a number of companies who will do that. Now, there's a designation called Fair Trade, and so you can get a Fair Trade designation. It's expensive, takes a lot of time to get through. It's probably not practical for most manufacturers to do that, but many companies have on their websites published their human rights policies, as well as what they do to make sure that their supply chains are slave-free or fair labor practices. That there are many that do not, but there are many that do. And so we're starting to see a change, but products produced with slave labor are very, very cheap. And so it's a balance with most people in terms of what they're willing to live with. Most people don't even know, but there's a lot you can do to look in terms of fair labor practices and making sure companies are slave-free. Some of them do a better job of audits on their supply chain than others. But there are a number of companies who are getting better and better of explaining that to their customers. Generally, you can find it somewhere on the website, kind of deep down into policies and stuff like that. Some companies are not quite so good. California, I believe it was maybe a year or two ago, started requiring companies to make those types of disclosures if they do business in California. Sometimes when you go out, they'll say it's in accordance with, the California law, and they'll cite the law. So it really can be all of us. We've got a lot more laws in place than other parts of the world to protect workers. Not to say that there aren't some cases of labor trafficking here in the United States, because we know that there are. But there is a lot more opportunity for folks to contact resources if they're being unfairly treated here than in some other countries. So it really is all of us. There's probably some general things to look for. Control is a significant piece of what the trafficker needs to do to get the trafficking victim to do something. A lot of times, if you have a situation where someone is not speaking for themselves, in some cases there may be a language barrier, because certainly someone who doesn't speak English in this country is more vulnerable to having someone else speak for them. It doesn't mean there's a trafficking situation by any stretch of the imagination, but if there is a situation where there appears to be some sort of control and abusive situation, and someone who just can't speak or won't speak for themselves, a lot of times trafficking will get confused with abuse, some sort of abuse, because that's what we're kind of geared to looking for. So if you see those types of things, it may or may not be a trafficking situation, but you need to make sure that you notify the proper authorities. Trafficking victims, it's going to be really hard. It's a lot of times it's when we're talking to healthcare workers and things like that, you're looking for signs of not just people who are controlled and can't speak for themselves, abuse, torture, and when I say torture, signs of torture, so burn, cigarette burns, things like that. Also, hygiene isn't necessarily the top priority, so dental problems, things like that. You should understand that it's going to be really, really difficult to make sure that it's going to be really, really difficult for you to know whether or not there's force, fraud, or coercion, unless it's an extreme event. But the thing is that you can call the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline. It's open 24/7, toll free. The number is 888-3737-888. If you call them, you can also text "Be Free" all caps. If you call them or text them, provide them with the information. They have a link into law enforcement. They will follow up on it. That's all you need to do. We had a situation here locally where there was a candidate for office. So they were driving around a lot and stopping at gas stations, and this was maybe two plus years ago, who had mentioned that he saw a younger girl asking for money, and there was a gentleman off to the side who was much older, so it was a situation that just didn't look right, who was appeared to be controlling her and having her do this. Didn't look like a father-daughter situation at all. And he asked what he could do, and he called the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, also local law enforcement as well. We've had a lot of conversations with local law enforcement, and most of them really understand what the issue is. Some of them have had training, and so you call them, and what we've been told here in Spotsylvania County is just explain the situation. You don't even need to stay. The law enforcement will go check it out. So what you don't want to do is put yourself in a position where you may get yourself harmed. So that's why, making the phone call, texting, very easy to do. A couple of things. First, we're trying to raise awareness, and January is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. So that's one of the things that we're trying to do. We do free movie nights, we have guest speakers, and those types of things. The other things that we're trying to do, we have education that's focused on, right now, healthcare workers and hotel motel workers. We do have a program that we want to get kicked off probably in the spring or later with regard to gas stations, because gas stations are another place where you will see human trafficking victims. We're looking at prevention, both in school settings as well as prevention in church youth groups. Just because a child goes to church doesn't necessarily mean that they're immune from this. We certainly know that there are vulnerabilities throughout our society. We're also doing evenings of prayer with churches and trying to work with churches to do church mobilization. And we're also looking at aftercare. We've been involved with some advocacy efforts where we've tried to explain or give our local state local state elected officials information. Last year we were part of the Kids Are Not for Sale Coalition that passed the first standalone human trafficking legislation in Virginia. Within 10 days of it going effective, someone was being charged under it, which was really cool. The last but not least, we're looking at aftercare and working with other groups and organizations who have similar goals and interests. It's not a competition. We're going to be stronger if we work together because traffickers are working together. You can contact us on our website, which is centralvajusticeinitiative.com. And there's a contact page which has our toll-free number as well as our email address, and you can put your contact information. Also, we have a page where you can request a guest speaker too.
DMV experience where we uplift, motivate, inspire, and encourage with Princess. Bringing you Christian music, spoken word,
your words drop louder than bombs over Baghdad,
insightful interviews,
that's a very good question,
and community events.
Well, okay, I have a couple announcements that
from the DMV and around the world.